One of the most frequent questions I get from new Manga Studio users is, where can I find a particular tool? And more often than not, it's because the tool isn't visible on the tools palette. Now, if you notice, there are a set number of tools on the tools palette, but there are so many more at your disposal. And because of that, it wouldn't make sense to place them all on the tools palette here, because otherwise we wouldn't have any place to draw. So to cover this issue, Manga Studio divides each tool into a series of subtools, which you can find here on the subtools palette. Now, in this case, we have the pen tool, so we have our G pen and a mapping pen, and we have the effect line pen, which is cool if you want to create cool effects. It automatically tapers. I'll clear that. And we even have a subset of markers to choose from, like our Milli pen, and a felt pen, and a mono pen. And some tools, which seemingly don't match up, clear that out, like the direct draw tool, share space with the frame tool and the ruler tool, among others. Now, because these tools share real estate on the tools palette, whatever subtool is active is the one that will appear on the tools palette. So right now, we see the ruler's icon here. If I switch to direct draw, you'll see the currently selected subtool rectangle. So that's where the confusion comes in. I suggest, as we go through this course, pay attention to the general location of where I am clicking to select the tool. If you don't see it on your tools palette, check that general location, then come up to subtools and see if you can find it as one of the subtools or subtool subsets. Now, each tool and subtool has a collection of settings that we can adjust so we can tweak how that tool looks and behaves. And these settings are located right here on the tool properties palette. Now, each tool is going to have a variety of options to choose from. For example, we have the rectangle tool properties, but if I switch to the marker tool, it's a different selection to choose from. Now, the time needed to cover each individual tool's tool properties would take forever. So what I'm going to do is go and explain the tools that are common among most, if not all, of the tools we'll be covering in this course. And let's start right from the top. We have brush size, and that's fairly self-explanatory. It sets the size of the brush you're working on. So you just click and drag to set the brush size, or you can click the arrows here to tick it up and down, or you can click the number and enter the value in manually. I'm going to switch over to the Milli pen. You can adjust the opacity, or how opaque or transparent the line you draw is. I'll adjust the size here so we can see it. So that's the line at 100% opacity, and that means I get a nice solid black line. If I reduce the opacity to 25% and draw the same line, it's more transparent, which allows me actually the ability to slowly build the color up. Not necessarily useful for a pen, but if I were painting or using the pencil tool, being able to adjust the opacity and build the line that I'm trying to rough out or paint will be very nice. Now we have two functions that work essentially the same: stabilization and post-correction. And what they do is adjust for potential jitter as you are drawing. Sometimes you'll notice this if you're drawing on a drawing tablet, or if the monitor that you're drawing on may have a little bit of a jitter to it. I'll kind of exaggerate a little bit, but you can kind of see a little bit of the jitter that I'm drawing here. Stabilization helps to correct any potential jitter as you're drawing. Right now it's set to 0, but if I turn it up to its maximum preset and then draw, it'll actually smooth the line out a little bit more. And that's not even all the settings. If you right-click, you can actually change from indicator or your presets to a slider. So you get additional choices. I can bump this up all the way to 100%. And now when I draw, it draws a nice, smooth line. Now here's something to keep in mind with stabilization. When I drew it, the line not only went smoothly, but the computer kept up with it pretty well. If you're on a slower machine or an older machine, you may find at a high stabilization that the computer kind of lags behind. So I suggest finding that sweet spot between jitter control and your computer's processing power. Clear out, and I'm going to switch over to the effect line to demonstrate post-correction. I'm going to turn off the tapering starting and ending to demonstrate. Now post-correction does the same thing as stabilization, except instead of changing the jitter control as you're drawing, it affects it afterwards. So post-correction is turned off, and I'll kind of jitter it a little bit. And now if I set it to the maximum preset, and I'll kind of exaggerate my jitter a little bit, it automatically corrects it to pretty much a straight line. And again, If you right click, you can change from the preview to slider and really bump up the post correction. You're not going to have that same issue that you do with stabilization as far as potential lag with your computer because it happens after the line is drawn. But now it's just a case of finding that sweet spot between jitter control and having too straight of a line. If I reduce the post correction a little bit, then I can kind of draw, and it does minor corrections without completely turning it into a straight line. So find that nice sweet spot for your jitter control and you should be all set to go. We're going to switch over to the direct draw tool, specifically the continuous curve. Clear this out. Now, when you use a tool that allows you to create a nice continuous curve, you're essentially going to be placing points on the canvas. And how those points are placed on the canvas will depend on the curve option you choose here. We have 4 options: straight line, spline, quadratic Bezier, and cubic Bezier. From the top, straight line creates straight lines between the points that you click on the canvas. Just click your points, straight line is created, and double click to finish your line. Clear out. Spline does the same thing, except instead of a straight line, it creates a subtle curve between the points. Clear that. Quadratic Bezier creates 3 control points to set up your curve: your start point, your midpoint, and as I set my end point, the curve is formed. And when I click, the midpoint is now my new start point. This is my new midpoint, and I set my new endpoint. And the process continues until my curve is done. Double click. There's my curve. And finally, cubic Bezier works similar to spline in that we're going to be placing points on the canvas with one additional option. If I click and then drag, you'll see this 1 point. And this sets the start of my curve. I release, and now when I set my second one, point, and then click and drag, and I get 2 points this time, and this sets my curve direction and intensity. And when I am happy with that, release, and then continue with the next curve, and so on until it's done. Brush shape lets us choose the way that the line is going to look from a variety of presets. Right now, the brush shape is generally set to pen, but you can choose different types like pencil or spray or rough edged or bumpy or pretty much any of these patterns. So in place of, and I'll use star for an example, in place of a solid black line, we're going to get, I'll zoom in a little bit, a pattern of stars for our line. So if you want to create an interesting little pattern line, that's one way to do it. Go back to pen, clear out, come back to full screen. I'm going to switch over to the rectangle tool because I want to show 2 options that you'll be seeing when using the shape. Aspect type allows us to set an aspect ratio. Right now, I can create any kind of rectangle that I want. Bump up the brush size here. If I click aspect type, clear that, I will now have it set to a specific aspect ratio. Right now, it's 1:1. So I'll be creating a perfect square. I can bump it up to, like, say 1.7, and now create a rectangle. And it doesn't matter what direction I draw, it'll create a 1 to 1.7 rectangle. Clear out. If I didn't want to do it by percentage, I can click by specified length. And then in this case, I have a 100 pixel square. And I don't even have to go far to drag to create the square. It'll just automatically create a 100 pixel by 100 pixel square. To adjust the value, click and drag the slider, or use the arrow keys, or enter a value in manually. If you want to adjust the angle of your shape before it's placed on the canvas, check the Adjust Angle After Fixed checkbox. Now, and I'll turn off aspect type, when I click and drag to create the rectangle, if I normally released, the rectangle will be formed. With that checked, I release, and now I can set the angle that I want. Happy with that? Click, and there's my rectangle at the angle that I'd like. I'll clear out. And finally, if at any time I want to take my tool and return them all to their default settings, I just come over here and click the Reset Settings button. It'll ask if I want that, hit OK, and my rectangle is back to default. Now here's the really funny thing about these tool properties. Depending on the tool, we might not even be scratching the surface of the options available. If I click on the wrench icon here, this brings up the Subtool Details window. And as you can see, there are even more options available for the rectangle tool or the pen tool or practically every tool in Manga Studio. So with very few exceptions, I'm actually not going to be diving into subtool details very often. And this is because as a new user to Manga Studio, it's very important to become comfortable with the basics of how these tools work. But that said, I suggest after you've become more comfortable with the default settings of your tool, open up subtool details, check out the options, play around with them, and see what you can do to make these tools behave the way that you would like them to behave.